So now let's take a look at the startup and shutdown procedures for the cluster. So starting up the XMS is pretty simple. If you have the virtual XMS, you just use the power on command in your management console. So for vCenter or VMware environments, you'd go to vCenter, right click on the virtual machine for XMS and tell it to power on. For the physical XMS, you would just use the power button that's on the left side of the physical server. And then for both of them, wait a few minutes, give the Linux kernels time to boot up, give the software for the XMS time to start, and then ping the appropriate IP address. Just a word, you will get a response back on the ping before the XMS is up. The Linux kernel will boot, the network interfaces will come up, and then give it a few more minutes for the actual XMS services to start. Battery backups. There are two models of battery backups. These two images at the bottom were taken out of the, I think it's the user guide, or I think it's the operations guide for the Extreme IO system. At 70% charge, these things do automatically come on themselves, but below that they won't. If you want to power them on manually, you'll need to figure out which one you have, and then confirm they are not powered on. Basically look for a power interface, and then use the power button on the front. So you'll just press and hold the power button on the front, and I've got the diagrams there. You want to make sure they're not already on because you don't want to accidentally power them off, but both of them will show a powered on light. Depending on the model again. But just confirm that. And again, at 70% charge, they come on automatically. Starting up the controllers is pretty easy. Normally we do this via the CLI, and it makes use of the IPMI connection on the back of the controllers, that lights out management connection. So you'll just log into the XMS. As we saw in the last lab, you can just SSH in, do the show storage controllers, and then do power on. So you can do power on SCID, which is your controller ID from the previous command, and it will go ahead and boot up. Also, you don't have to SSH in. If you remember from our UI overview with the XMS, there is a tab for the CLI. You could do it from there, but I find it's quicker and easier just to SSH in. Wait a few minutes, and again, ping the right IP address to make sure they are online. If that doesn't work, there is a physical button on the front left of each controller, very similar to what you'd see on the physical XMS, and you can use that to go ahead and power them up. Starting the cluster, as you can see in the screenshot, we use the CLI command start cluster. You issue that, and after a few minutes, the cluster will come up. Then you wait, and you can check the status to see how it's going by using the show clusters command. Shutting down. So before you shut down, you want to confirm there's nothing using the array. So do show clusters and do show clusters performance. You want to see no I/O activity. If you do see I/O, it means that there's an application accessing the storage, and you probably want to make sure that that is shut down before you go and start powering off the systems, or else you're going to leave that application in an inconsistent state. Again, on the shutdowns, I always suggest that people look at the documentation for your version of the software. This has changed a little bit. It may change in the future. So as we go through this in a minute, it is current as of version 2.3. But again, always consult your documentation, especially on a shutdown. I don't want you to do a bad shutdown and have a problem. So for a software shutdown, you want to make sure XMS is talking to the clusters. So do a show clusters, and you want the state to be active. If it's not active, if it's stopped, that means the cluster has already been stopped. If it's active, it means it's actively working. If it's not either of those two, call EMC support before you do a shutdown. You may shut down a cluster that's in a bad state and have a problem bringing it back up. Assuming that you see that you do a show clusters and it's active, issue the command stop cluster unorderly to shut the cluster down. It's interesting that they do use the unorderly command. I confirmed this with the current documentation instead of just stop cluster. Again, that's one reason I tell you to always confirm the latest version of the documentation. But as of 2.3, you do a stop cluster unorderly. And if you also want to shut down the XMS, you do shutdown XMS, shutdown type equals service. Shutting down the hardware, again, perform a show clusters to confirm the cluster services are down, then issue shutdown cluster ID equals 1, and then it'll down all the controllers in the cluster. And to power off the virtual XMS, again, do it from your virtual environment. So you go into like vCenter and right click and shut down that guest OS. For physical, you can do it straight from the XMS itself. You'll do shutdown-XMS. Shutdown type is machine. So that'll go ahead and start powering off the physical machine. Emergency shutdown. So if you need to do this very quickly, you will from the XMS issue stop cluster unorderly, and then you'll issue the power off command with the storage controller numbers. Then you'll power off the XMS as we just talked about. If you need to physically power down the environment very quickly, there's a facilities type emergency. You can actually walk up, pull out the DAE cables from the first X brick, so probably the one at the very bottom, wait for the blue LEDs to start blinking on all controllers, and then you can pull power to the rack. Basically, what you're wanting it to do is to kind of panic and dump the metadata, make sure that is destaged down to disk, and then you can power the system down. Again, this needs to be an actual honest emergency. Don't do this because you're in a hurry. Do this because the data center's flooding or there's a fire or something like that.